I want to start with a number, 1820. That's the year we're told Antarctica was first sighted. First officially sighted, they'll clarify if you press them. First recorded, first documented, first acknowledged. For most of my life, I accepted that without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? It's in the textbooks. It sits neatly on the timelines. It's the kind of fact you absorb in school the same way you absorb everything else. Passively, without resistance, without asking why. But eventually I started looking more closely at the dates. And once I did, I couldn't stop. Before we go any further, I need to briefly return to something I covered in the last video in this series. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it below, because what follows won't carry its full weight without that foundation. In that episode, I explored what mainstream history calls the year without a summer, 1816. The year after the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which according to the official record ejected enough ash into the atmosphere to lower global temperatures, destroy harvests across the northern hemisphere, kill livestock, trigger famine from New England to northern Europe, and turn summer into something resembling winter. Tambora, a single volcano. The explanation is tidy. The timeline is clean. But then I started pulling on threads that didn't quite belong to that story. Because here's what the official account doesn't really explain: the uniformity. The sheer, sweeping, continent-spanning simultaneity of the collapse. Crop failures weren't regional, they were global. Reports of unnatural cold, of snow in June, of orange and purple sunsets weren't clustered near Indonesia. They appeared everywhere at once. And the disruption wasn't only environmental. It was social, political, structural. The years immediately following 1816 saw a cascade of institutional ruptures, population displacements, and what one researcher I came across described as civilizational amnesia, entire communities that seemed to lose continuity with what came before. In that video, I proposed something that I know made a lot of you uncomfortable. And good. It should. I suggested that the year without a summer may not have been purely volcanic, or more precisely, that it may not have been only volcanic. That the atmospheric disruption of 1816 carries the hallmarks of something more catastrophic, more deliberate. Something closer, in its signature, to what we would today recognize as a nuclear winter, a sudden total atmospheric blackout, not from a mountain, but from a civilization-ending event. A reset. The kind of event that leaves behind not just climate data, but erasure. The kind of event now loosely associated with the hypothesis that before the 19th century there existed a global Old World civilization, sophisticated, architecturally advanced, connected across continents, what many researchers provisionally refer to as Tartaria. Not an empire in the conventional sense. Not a country with borders on a modern map. Something harder to define. A presence. A civilization whose fingerprints begin appearing everywhere once you learn to recognize them. In the architecture. In the canal systems. In the city grids that seem to appear fully formed in the historical record. Without construction documentation, without scaffolding periods, without the messy, incremental archaeology that usually accompanies human settlement. And then, apparently, it was simply gone. We covered all of that. But there was one detail I kept circling back to, one date I kept setting aside because it felt almost too convenient. Too perfectly placed. The date Antarctica was discovered. 4 years after the year without a summer. I want you to hold that gap in your mind. 4 years. Not a generation, not a century. 4 years after what may have been the most catastrophic atmospheric event in recorded human history. An event that, if my previous analysis holds, may have functioned as the final act of a global civilizational collapse. An event during which the entire world experienced freezing simultaneously. And then, suddenly, the most remote, most inaccessible, most sealed, most frozen landmass on Earth is officially discovered. And not by one expedition. By 3. A British crew. An American crew. A Russian crew. All operating independently, we're told. All in the same region. All within months of each other. All in 1820. Now I'm not going to stand here and tell you that's impossible. People chase discoveries. Expeditions overlap. Competition drives exploration. I understand all of that. But I want to ask a different kind of question. Not whether it happened, but why then? Why, after millennia of human civilization, after the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, and every sophisticated maritime culture that ever put a hole to open water, does the largest landmass south of the equator remain entirely undiscovered, undocumented, and unnamed until 4 years after the world's sky went dark? Why then? Because this is where the conventional account starts to develop cracks. The deeper I went into the cartographic record, and I mean deep, into archives that rarely appear in introductory history courses, the more the 1820 discovery date began to look less like a beginning and more like a cover story. There are maps, real maps, historically documented, that appear to show Antarctica long before 1820. The Pyrie Reis map, dated 1513 and drawn by an Ottoman admiral who explicitly stated he compiled it from older source maps, shows a southern landmass with a detailed, accurate coastline. Not a vague blob. Not a speculative fringe. A charted coastline that, when 20th century researchers overlaid it against modern satellite imaging of the subglacial terrain, the actual rock beneath 2 miles of ice, aligned with a precision no one has adequately explained. The Orance Fine map from 1531 goes even further. It depicts Antarctica without ice, complete with river systems, mountain ranges, and internal geographic features that we only confirmed existed using mid-20th century sonar technology. Let me say that again more slowly, because it's easy to read past it. A map drawn in 1531 shows geographic features of Antarctica that humanity did not technologically confirm until the 1950s. The official explanation begins to break down almost immediately under the weight of that sentence. Historically, the academic response has been some combination of coincidence, lucky extrapolation, or the suggestion that ancient cartographers were simply guessing at the existence of a southern landmass for philosophical reasons: symmetry, balance, the idea that the north must be matched by the south. And maybe that's true. Maybe it is coincidence. But how do you guess a river? How do you guess subglacial mountain ridges? How do you guess a coastline with enough accuracy that it survives comparison with satellite data 5 centuries later? You don't guess that. You don't theorize it. You map it, from observation, from presence, from knowledge that was either firsthand or inherited from someone who had been there. And that raises a question the mainstream record has never satisfactorily answered. Who was there? If you're finding this worth your time, and I hope you are, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This series goes places most channels won't touch, and having you along for it genuinely means a lot. Now, back to Antarctica, because we're only getting started. I want to return to 1816 for a moment, because I think we may have been looking at it from the wrong angle. In the previous video, I laid out the case that the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever its true cause, may have functioned as the terminal moment of an old-world civilization. The event that ended something. The nuclear winter that followed what may have been a civilization-scale catastrophe, leaving behind depopulated cities, orphaned infrastructure, and a historical record so thin it barely qualifies as a record at all. But what if that framing is only partially correct? What if 1816 was not just an ending? What if it was also, for someone, a beginning? Here is the theory I've been sitting with, and I want to be clear that I'm presenting this as a question, not a conclusion. What if the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever generated it, was capable not only of disrupting the northern hemisphere's climate but also of accelerating glaciation at the poles? What if the same mechanism that turned summer into winter across Europe and North America also, in some compounding way, drove ice formation southward? What if Antarctica, the ice-free continent visible on 16th century maps, was in the process of freezing, or had recently frozen, and 1816 was either the final phase of that process or a deliberate rehearsal of it? I know that's a significant claim. And again, I'm not presenting it as a claim. I'm presenting it as a pattern, a shape formed by timing, geography, and suppression that I cannot stop thinking about. Because consider what comes next. 1816, the sky goes dark. A global atmospheric event of unprecedented scope disrupts civilization. 1820, Antarctica is discovered, officially entered into the record, named, catalogued, claimed. Not before. Not during. after. For years after. The pattern appears, and once you notice it, it becomes difficult to unfocus your eyes from it. And the timeline doesn't stop at 1820. The same thread, the maps, the knowledge, the carefully guarded secret of what Antarctica actually is, keeps surfacing decades later in the hands of people who had every resource in the world to go and look. 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy launches Operation High Jump, a full military expedition to Antarctica. Not a research team. Not a small exploratory vessel. 13 ships. 33 aircraft. Nearly 5,000 military personnel. All led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific mapping, research, and establishing a base. And maybe that's all it was. But here's the detail that makes the timing impossible to ignore. The Americans were not the first military power to take Antarctica seriously. Not even close. In 1938, 7 years before High Jump, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition, the Schwabenland Expedition. They mapped nearly 600,000 square kilometers of territory, dropped thousands of marker stakes to assert territorial claim, and reportedly returned with something that shifted internal priorities at the highest levels. What exactly? We're not told. The records are incomplete in the specific way records tend to be when the answer matters. What we do know is that German submarines were documented operating in Antarctic waters as late as 1945, and that certain senior figures within the Nazi scientific apparatus maintained a documented obsession with ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, deep prehistory, and inherited cartographic traditions that supposedly predated the modern world. The same maps. The same thread. Which brings us back to what I've started calling the custodian problem. The Piri-Reis map. The Orance Fine map. The Ottoman admiral who produced the Piri-Reis chart explicitly stated that he compiled it from older source maps, sources that are never named, never located, never accounted for. Someone held that knowledge. Some chain of hands preserved it across centuries, across the rupture of 1816, intact enough that multiple parties, an Ottoman admiral, a Nazi expedition, and later an American naval fleet, were apparently able to follow that knowledge to the same place. Who were they? And what did all three find when they got there? The evidence doesn't answer those questions. But it doesn't dismiss them either. Now I want to talk about something we're not really allowed to do. Because this is the part of the Antarctica conversation that most people skip past, and I think it may be the most important part. You cannot freely go to Antarctica. I want to be precise about that statement, because the casual response is always the same. Of course you can. Expeditions go there all the time. And yes, they do. Scientific expeditions. Government-sanctioned research missions. Tourism, even in limited and highly supervised forms. I'm not claiming the continent is surrounded by some invisible wall. What I'm saying is this. The Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959 and now ratified by more than 50 nations, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve and explicitly prohibits military activity, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing on the continent. In practice, this means that independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior is essentially impossible. Not illegal, exactly. Just practically impossible. You need logistical support that only governments or large institutions can provide. You need permissions that are quietly difficult to obtain for anything outside approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that simply does not exist for independent travelers. The result is that Antarctica is functionally the one place on Earth where an ordinary citizen of the 21st century simply cannot go and look around. And I want to ask something that sounds simple but becomes strange the longer you sit with it. Why does that feel normal to us? Every other landmass on the planet, every mountain range, every jungle, every desert, can be accessed by a motivated individual with enough resources and determination. People climb Everest recreationally. People cross the Sahara alone. People sail to the most remote islands on Earth with nothing but a small boat and a compass. But Antarctica has a treaty. 50 nations signed it in the same decade that sonar technology first confirmed what was hiding beneath the ice. And somehow we don't find that remarkable. We nod along. We accept that the treaty is about science, about peace, about environmental preservation. Maybe it is. But the evidence suggests something else that is extremely rare in human history: simultaneous global agreement. Nations do not agree on almost anything. They disagree about borders, about resources, about ideology, about language, about everything. The 20th century was practically defined by national disagreement. Except here. Except about this one place. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore the longer you sit with it. 50 nations. All agreeing. All signing. All maintaining that agreement consistently for decades, about a frozen continent that officially contains nothing but ice and penguins. What is it about ice and penguins that requires an international treaty? And this is where the conversation intersects with something we've been documenting across this entire series: the architecture problem. Across multiple episodes we've documented, imperfectly and provisionally but still documented, the presence of old-world construction techniques in places where they have no business appearing. Buildings that enter the historical record fully complete, without visible construction phases. Civic infrastructure in cities supposedly founded in the early 19th century that would have required decades of labor and resources those settlements simply did not possess. Cathedrals in frontier towns. Elaborate sewer systems in cities that, according to the official record, were wilderness 5 years before those systems appeared. Then there is the mud flood evidence: buried ground floors, windows that begin below what is now street level, entire architectural levels submerged beneath modern cities, either because the street level rose or because something came down and covered what was already there. This pattern repeats across North America, across Europe, across Russia, across South America. It is not regional. It is not isolated. It is global. And every time the pattern is documented, the official explanation tends to fall into one of two categories: dismissal, or a kind of casual hand-waving that dissolves the moment you compare it with the actual evidence. The transition periods are missing. The documentation is thin. The workforce that supposedly built these structures is unaccounted for. The supply chains don't exist. The timelines simply do not work. Something was already there. Something was built by someone who came before. Now bring Antarctica back into the picture. We know from the cartographic evidence, from the ice-free maps and from subglacial topography, that Antarctica was at some point in historical time a habitable landmass. Not geologically ancient. Historically recent. Recent enough that human beings mapped it. Recent enough that those maps survived into the 16th century, copied from even older sources. So the question becomes unavoidable. What was on that continent? What is under 2 miles of ice right now? I'm not saying there are pyramids under the Antarctic ice sheet, though there are formations in the Ellsworth Mountains that have generated genuine academic debate about their geometry. I'm not saying there is a lost city sealed under the Ross ice shelf. I'm asking something simpler, and I think ultimately more important. Why don't we know? Why, in 2025, with ground-penetrating radar capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with satellites that can read a license plate from orbit, with the full weight of the most technologically advanced civilization in recorded history pointed at every corner of the Earth, why is the subglacial topography of Antarctica still largely unmapped at high resolution? Why do the gaps in the data cluster in the interior? Why does the silence persist? Because once you start listening for it, the silence is everywhere in this story. No serious mainstream academic discussion of the Piri-Reis map in introductory curricula. At best, it appears as a footnote, if it appears at all. No sustained institutional inquiry into the coordination problem of 1820, when 3 independent expeditions arrived at an undiscovered continent almost simultaneously. No convergence. Just coincidence. Moving on. No institutional curiosity about the gap between the ice-free maps of the 16th century and the frozen wasteland officially discovered in the 19th. No explanation for how, if Antarctic ice accumulated over geological time as we're told, human cartographers produced maps showing the uncovered terrain within historical time. The silence isn't accidental. Silence on this scale, across this many disciplines, maintained for this long, is not simply an absence of evidence. It's a shape, and that shape suggests something. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it suggests. I think you already feel it. I want to close with something that has been sitting with me since I first started pulling this thread. If we accept, provisionally and carefully with all appropriate skepticism, that there existed before the 19th century a global civilization of significant sophistication, if we accept that this civilization left behind infrastructure, maps, architectural techniques, and knowledge that our official history struggles to account for, if we accept that the events of 1816 represented, in some form, the terminal convulsion of that civilization, a collapse so total and so violent that it left atmospheric scars visible across the northern hemisphere, and if we accept that Antarctica, the last unmapped, ice-free landmass on those older charts, was sealed, frozen, treaty-locked, and quietly removed from public access in the years immediately following, then we have to ask the hardest question of all. What were they protecting? Not necessarily from us. Maybe from time. Maybe from chaos. Maybe simply from the kind of casual, uncoordinated discovery that might have happened if anyone with a ship and a curiosity could sail south and start digging. What knowledge was stored there? What records? What architecture? What evidence of a civilization that we have, through some combination of catastrophe, deliberate erasure, and institutional incuriosity, been prevented from knowing? I don't have the answer. I want to be honest with you about that. I've been sitting with these questions for months, and they have not resolved. They've only deepened. The further I go into the record, the more I find not answers but structure, the shape of something deliberately obscured. Something whose outlines I can trace without being able to see its face. And once you see that structure, you cannot unfocus your eyes from it. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816, unprecedented in its scope and duration. An official continent discovered 4 years later by 3 nations at once. A continent sealed by 50 nations a century after that. Ancient maps that appear to show what lies beneath the ice. A historical record that goes silent precisely where continuity should exist. Architecture without builders. Cities without origins. A civilization without a gravestone. And a continent, renamed, restricted, ice-covered, and quietly held just out of reach, that may contain, under 2 miles of frozen silence, the answer to all of it. Maybe, or maybe not. But I can't stop thinking about the number 1820. And I have a feeling you won't either. If this series has been worth something to you, consider leaving your thoughts or theories in the comments below. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. I think I'm now. See you there.